There you go. There we are. I'm up here because I've had maybe 12 years ago, I had an experience that turns out is relatively typical. I couldn't figure out why there was a pagoda in the middle of Forest Glen section of Silver Spring. And I've been thinking about that now for 12 years and having a lot of fun, and ending up surprisingly being a tour guide, pointing out the pagoda to folks who come every fourth Saturday between March and November on behalf of the tours are offered by Save Our Seminary at Forest Glen, Save Our Seminary, or SOS. I should say, by the way, that any factual statements or opinions that I express are my own. I'm not here on behalf of SOS, but I'm here because I'm a member of SOS. So I'm going to talk about National Park Seminary, which later becomes National Park College, which was a school for girls from 1894 until the Army took it over in 1942. And there's the history. I want to talk about the academic program, but I really felt like I should at least give a little bit of the background. I'll try to do that as fast as I can. Tobacco plantations originally. When the railroad comes through, it cuts off a little slice of the northern of the two plantations. That's 1873. And so the owner then sells to a group called the Forest Glen Improvement Company. In 1887, they build a hotel. The hotel was to be the anchor of a real estate development. These themes will come back again. It's a real estate development again. That fails miserably. After about 6 years of the real estate development, the idea was come to the hotel, get on the train, leave the city, come to the hotel, walk across this wonderful iron trestle bridge that they had there, go to the hotel, and then you and your spouse can tour around in the neighborhood and find a spot that you like, and we'll sell you the land and build you a house. Almost no one did that. At the very end, they were still trying to keep the hotel open, so they thought, we'll bring people into the hotel like hotcakes. We'll, to mix the metaphor, we'll open a casino. This is another movie that we've heard before. That didn't work either, and so they closed the doors, and immediately upon doing so, a couple from Virginia who had been trying very hard to find a place to locate a girls' school. They worked at another girls' school at the time in Norfolk, but they wanted to own their own school. They had been trying to lease the place. They couldn't buy. They couldn't afford to buy it, but they wanted to lease it. And so when the hotel closed after the financial panic of 1893, they said, "Oh well, leasing sounds like a good idea after all," and invited them back. And so they leased the place and opened the school. The lease was signed in April. They opened the school in September of 1894, the fourth Thursday of September, 1894, with 48 students. And we'll meet them later. So then it becomes a school, and it remains a school, although it changes its name in 1937. It's wildly popular. It was a terrible place for a hotel and a real estate development at the time. It turned out to be a fabulous place for a school. It starts with 48 students. By the 1929-30, they have 400 students. And then something happens, and 2 years later, they have back 40 students. The Great Depression, of course, the problem. It was then repositioned as National Park College. And I'll talk more about that when I get to the academic program, and was trying to make a comeback when Japan struck Pearl Harbor and the United States declares war on Nazi Germany, and one thing leads to another, and the Army decides that what they should do, they're going to need hospital beds, and the way to get that is to take over institutions that exist and convert them into hospitals. And so a number of seminaries, I think perhaps all three that we're talking about today, were taken over by the military. This program tragically lasted just a very short while because they learned very fast that that instead of saving money and saving time, it was actually more expensive and took longer to buy an existing facility and convert it to the use that they wanted it for than it did to simply buy an empty field and build a place from scratch, the way you wanted it to start with. So, but they didn't learn that lesson until tragically all these schools had been closed. And then I'm going to skip the rest of it other than it's just there. The Army maintained it. It was a perfectly honorable use of the buildings for 30 years. That was the place where you went if you were a soldier who lost a limb or lost your hearing. And some of the psychological cases were there too. It was the rehabilitation facility primarily for the entire United States Army for many years. But the Army then didn't need the facility anymore after the Vietnam era, and one thing led to another, and essentially the Army just walked away, but they wouldn't give it up because they wanted the land. They liked the land, they just didn't like the buildings. It became a historic district. The National Park Seminary Historic District was declared something worthy of preservation in 1972, which sort of constrained the Army's plans. And I'm not anti anti-Army, by the way. My father was active duty 32 years. It's just that the Army doesn't preserve buildings; they knock them down. So finally, the Army, and this is where SOS comes in. And I was not a member of SOS in those days, so I can say without embarrassment, heroically, SOS worked very hard, and finally, the Army was persuaded to give up the property and sold it to a developer. And so, as I said, it started as a real estate development. It's now going to be a real estate development again. So now let's meet the folks quickly. This is John and Vesta Cassedy. They went to, some of these themes you've heard already today, you'll hear them again, I suppose. Ohio Wesleyan is where they went to school. John graduated first and got a job teaching at LaSalle Seminary in Massachusetts. Vesta graduated a couple of years later and taught 1 year in Missouri, and then joined John in Massachusetts, and they got married. And then he got a job as principal of Norfolk College for Women in Norfolk, Virginia. And she went with him and eventually got the title of lady principal. And they worked together very carefully, but they didn't like being employees. They wanted to own the place themselves. And that's what led them then to come. They decided that the place to be was Washington, but not in the city. They wanted it to be in the suburbs, and not in a former Confederate state, but rather in a state that had not seceded from the Union. So Maryland suburbs was ideal. And then it turned out that Forest Glen was the perfect spot. Next here, these are just two folks that I have to talk about because they're a couple of my favorites. The woman, the two above on the upper part of that picture, the one on the left is a Charlotte Priest. She was the first English teacher. She also happened to be the cousin of the guy who tried to put in the casino in the hotel. And so when he was making the leasing arrangements, he said, "Oh, by the way, I have a cousin, and she just graduated from Columbia University, and she needs a job, and she wants to teach." And they were desperate for an English teacher, so they hired her. And even though she only had a BA and was only maybe 4 years older than the girls she was going to be teaching, and so you never know how these things will work out. It turned out she was really wonderful at it, and she spent the rest of her life there. She taught for 35 years, she died in 1929, and she became the prefect of studies and was the assistant dean and ran the seminary, the sorority program that we'll talk about in a minute, and is one of my favorite people. One of the really neat things, by the way, a quick footnote, when you become a student of the history of teaching education of women in America, is you really run into some really amazing people. Charlotte Priest is one of them. The woman to her right is Catherine Munford. When I went to high school in the Southwest in New Mexico, it was the job was vice principal or assistant principal. Catherine Munford was the dean. She was the disciplinarian. So if you didn't make your bed, you heard from Catherine Munford. If a gentleman caller wanted to see you at the school on campus, he had to sit hat in hand and pass muster with Catherine Munford. If you didn't pass muster, you didn't see him. She came in 1907. The Cassedys hired her, and she became dean a couple of years after that. And she was still at the school in 1942 when the Army took it over. So she had a long career there as well. This is the second president. He took over in 1916. This is Dr. Ament and his wife, Teresa. There was a huge building program under the Cassedys, and you'll see some of the buildings here in a moment. Dr. Ament sort of continued that and enhanced it, but he did not change the educational policy. He was there in 1929-30 when the student body reached the height of 400, and then was still there, of course, 2 years later when it was down to fewer than 40. And was beginning to make progress to try to keep the place going as the Depression continued, but it cost him a great deal of difficulty with his health, and he eventually had to have an operation. And of course, in 1936, that was a dangerous business as it is today, but even more so then. And so he died of complications of the operation. Mrs. Ament tried to keep the school going on her own. It was just too much for her, so she then sold it to the third and final president, Roy Tasco Davis, who was an American diplomat. He had visited the campus at about the age of maybe 17 or so as a page for the last true autocratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, Joe Cannon, for whom the Cannon House Office Building is named, and loved the place and said that he wanted to own it. But he went on then to become a diplomat. So he was a United States ambassador to various countries in Central America, primarily Panama, sort of a national hero in Panama, because he prevented the Army from coming in when they were having political upheaval. But he then was also still interested in education, so he bought the school. He repositioned it, and there's an interesting debate about whether he really changed much, but he did repositioned it and changed the name to National Park College, made it a junior college officially. It already had that name unofficially, and changed the marketing plan, and also it began to emphasize more vocational education. And maybe you would have turned it around or not, we don't know, because then in 1942 it all got hit by a glacier because the Army came in very suddenly. So now the educational program, and I know you can't read this, but this is from the very first catalog that was printed in 1894 when they first signed the lease, and it's actually before they even hired Charlotte Priest, so her name doesn't appear in the faculty. But it's the course of study, and I wanted you to see it. There's a couple of pages of it because it's sort of unusual. It's 5 years. It's sub-freshman, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, oddly. And this is the English course. And if you look into that, you're studying science, you're studying Latin, you're studying mathematics, but you're also taking a lot of literature classes. And it's a 5-year program. And they did that consciously. The thought was, come send your daughter here. She'll finish high school. But then if she wants to go to college, have her stay in the nice protected environment of the good old National Park Seminary rather than going off to be wilds of college for that first year. So then when that's done, she can transfer to the college as a sophomore. I have no idea how persuasive that was. I have no idea how, unfortunately I don't have any statistics on how many girls actually went on to college. Or if you like, when she's done with high school after the first 4 years, then she can go take another year of finishing work. So that was, and they never called it a finishing school, but there is a level at which that seems like a perfectly accurate description. So 5-year program, not 6 or 4. And here's other possible courses of study. The Latin scientific course for 5 years, the modern language course, and then finally English. And then on the last page, let's see, how does the pointer work? I don't know if you can, yeah, there you go. This is, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what it says exactly. Right. The course in cultivation of voice, the course in art, drawing and painting, or the course in piano playing is the one at the bottom. And there's a wonderful debate, and I don't know the answer to the question, but on the one hand, you have these are so-called ornamental studies, which are sort of part of the finishing school idea, that you learn to speak French and you learn to play the piano a little. But on the other hand, they actually had full courses where you could get a degree in piano playing, in music, or a degree in art. So there's this interesting combination of finishing school and serious higher education going on at the same time. All essentially for daughters of wealthy families. And it's a niche market now. There are a lot of schools like this in the country at this time. It's no longer, because there's lots of other places girls can go to get higher education. This is priced in a way that it'll appeal only to people of means. I was always puzzled by what's a Latin scientific course. I never could figure that out, and I was very happy when I finally figured out the key. In the catalog itself, Mr. Cassedy writes that they wholly support the report of the Committee of 10 that had been published in 1893. And so that turns out to be what this is. The curriculum for the school essentially is a 5-year plan that was adopted from the report of the Committee of 10 on secondary education. And we can't talk about it much today, but that's a big piece of the history of secondary education in America, is that report and the implementation of that report. It was headed by the president of Harvard at the time, Charles Eliot. And then there were 9 conferences, each with 10 members. These were the subjects: Latin, Greek, English, other modern languages, mathematics, physics, natural history, meaning biology and all of its branches, history, and geography. And the plan was, how should these courses be taught in high school, and what courses should kids take, how many should they take, how long should it take each day, that sort of thing. This is a big comprehensive report. Each of these conferences had 10 members, so it was a total of 100 folks. The name, is right there, a very obscure professor of history from Princeton University, who had just gotten his PhD, and went on then to become the governor of New Jersey and the president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson was on that committee. So they did this chart. That chart, if you look at it, if you could see it, is the same. Is very much like the curriculum that I just showed you. The school also, though, taught lots of other things. And this is just a list of some of them, including home economics, of course, the secretarial course, the library course. All of that was available from about 1901 in over the various years. This is a typical schedule. Sorry, you can't see that. You can just see the grid. That runs from 8:40 in the morning till 9:20 at night. And you studied two 40-minute periods for each class that you took for 40 minutes, and then there was an hour for when you went to lunch and to chapel. There was an hour and a half where you dressed for dinner. The girls wore white gloves and all of that at dinner, and studying and did your sororities. They did physical education was big. The club life was big. That's the sororities, in addition to other programs on the campus. There's the gym from 1925. That's the girls playing basketball in the gym. The gym was built in 1907. They had a swimming pool and a shower. This is remember the bowling alley? That's the bowling alley. Another thing was clubs that was going on at the same time, and that's another piece of the history of women's education in America is the club movement, which culminated in the early 1890s with the founding of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. On campus, they used that idea for the sororities. The sororities were clubs where girls learned how to have a meeting, how to take a majority vote, and develop their skills at running the kinds of clubs that they would run when they went back home. And so that's an excuse to show the 4 sorority houses. These are the clubhouses. These are ones on the east side: a castle, a bungalow, a colonial mansion, and a windmill. The idea was that you would live in these. You wouldn't live in the houses. I'm sorry. You would have your meetings in these houses, and you would learn something about the culture by being of each of those represented by each building by having your club study that as part of their club activities. This is the west side with the Japanese pagoda, which is the famous building that everybody sees and wonders why it's there. That's how I got started, and the Spanish mission, and a Swiss chalet, and another bungalow. Every girl belonged to a sorority generally. And then eventually it became a 2-year college. And it's a question that I can't answer, is when did it change from being a 5-year program to being a 6-year program? I know that it was certainly by 1910 there were girls who had graduated from high school elsewhere and then came to the school for 2 years. It became official in 1912. In the catalog it was called National Park Seminary, a junior college for young women. And then in 1937 officially it changed the name to National Park College. And then I wanted to ask the question, did vocational education really increase over time? And it's impossible to answer because I don't have enough data, but I did my best with finding graduation announcements. So there's some from the early period, 13%, 8%. By the 20s, when the school is really huge, 22%, 19%. But then even in the 30s and 40s, yes, a little higher, but it's not so much higher. So that was available, but mostly the program was you studied English, you studied literature, and then went back home. Thank you.